some reason, I've always really liked making side plates. Pieces not large enough to have your dinner on, but those that are perfect for a slice of toast in the morning, or for a piece of cake in the afternoon. And so in this week's video, and in next week's too, I'm going to be doing some experimentation and searching for a new shape. But before I get into all of that, I'm first going to begin with the clay. This is some very soft reclaim, stuff recycled from previous projects, which I tried to wedge without adding any harder stuff, but it simply stuck to the table and was practically impossible to wedge up. So I did ultimately end up mixing it half and half with some much harder clay. Now, the reason I wanted to try and use this excessively soft clay is because making plates with very soft clay is much easier. As forms go, all you're doing really is centering the lump and then pressing it down into a flat disc, and if you're trying to do this with clay that's hard, you're basically just making the job far more difficult for yourself. So instead, whenever I make flatware, I try to use as soft clay as I can get away with, and even in this case, after mixing it down by 50%, roughly, the blended stoneware was still very malleable, meaning it'll be a breeze to center and squash down into a disc. I then spent a moment spiral wedging the lump to get it perhaps 60% of the way there, and then I cut it into two smaller, more manageable lumps to finish off. I've built up quite a collection of side plates. These are some that I use in the studio and at home, ranging from these mirror black Timecodes plates, which I actually made quite recently. They're a good size and they're trimmed to be really light, but they certainly don't feel like pots that sit within my family of work. Rather, I made them just for use in the workshop. Then there's a few like this, which are experiments really, using a range of matte and metallic glazes, which I'd never sell, but it gets good use in the workshop. There's even a few ancient solidified pieces I made during my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond all the way back in 2015. They're a bit too small, really, and please excuse this messy trimming on the bottoms of these. I was still very much finding my voice at this point, but I like them. They're jaunty fellows with a lot of character, and I like the flashing and shell marks they have. Next are the side plates that do more or less fit within my style, starting with these simple flanged vessels that have a much more traditional shape, but again it's missing something that makes it sit within my body of work. And again it's just a fraction too small I think, although it's glazed nicely and it works. Then we've got these simple flat dishes, which are perhaps the most modern of the lot. This is an old one, it's thick and heavy, but it almost doesn't matter, as its heft is apparent in its appearance. I really like these as they feel like canvases for the glaze, and when there is subtle discoloration in the glaze itself, it almost makes them look as if they're a planet or something. They're minimal and simple, and here's an updated version made with a much finer rim and a foot, which makes the entire vessel lighter. This feels more delicate and more similar to the work I'm currently producing, but I wonder, in the same way I've been experimenting with the feet of my pots recently, if there's more that can be done. More visual interest on the top surface, such as steps, slopes, indentations, and ways of linking them back to other shapes I make. And so in this video, that's what I'm going to be throwing. Tests. I think this side plate is the perfect size, so I'll measure it, and all the others that I'll make I'll throw to be roughly 12% larger than this, as that's how much this stoneware shrinks, which means I need to be aiming at about 22 centimeters wide. Now, as none of the shapes I'll be making are going to have excessively large or overhanging flanges, I can use less clay than I normally might. So, for all of these side plates I'm going to be using about 2 pounds of clay, which is just over 900 grams. The soft clay is given a good wedge, although air pockets in forms like this won't be much of an issue, as they can be easily popped, and they don't create undulations in quite the same way as they do when they appear in the walls of your pot. It's still freezing outside, so I'm of course using piping hot water to throw with, and I even fill the bucket I wash my hands in throughout the day with hot water too. And even after about 4 or 5 hours, it's still lukewarm, which just makes being a potter during this time of the year a bit nicer. Now, I'm going to be throwing these on wooden batts. Batts that are in fact much larger than the plates themselves, as this will make it easier to wire them off afterwards, as a pot thrown on a batt that's just about big enough to hold the vessel itself can be an absolute nightmare to wire off. And to attach these to the wheel, I'm first going to throw a clay batt, which is sort of just like making a plate itself. I centre a lump of clay and squash it into a disc, flatten it, and then I blast it with a heat gun to get it more or less leather hard. I score in some lines, as these help the wooden batt stick to it better. I lightly dampen the back of the MDF batt and the clay itself too. Place one onto the other, tap centre it, and then to get it to really stick I do this. I wiggle it back and forth in place until I can feel that there's no movement in it. I then dampen, not soak, a small patch in the middle of the MDF. which the lump of clay can be chucked against the slightly damp patch, helping the stoneware stick. And then the first thing I do is centre the lump of clay. I tend to begin by forcing the lump of clay down into a flat disc, whilst pinching it harshly right around the base with my small finger. This keeps the outermost edge nice and even. I then use my fist to compress it down, and then I switch to simply using the flat side of my palm to press the soft stoneware down even further, which again is very easy to do because the clay is just so soft. Hereafter, when flattening, I begin by applying pressure in the centre and then gradually working my hand out. And if I do find any air pockets, I simply take a potter's needle and poke it a good few times. This is normally enough to get rid of them, especially after running my hands over them and compressing them further. It's almost the right width. I won't be making them exactly 22 centimeters wide. Well, some of them will be, but as long as I'm within the ballpark, that's good enough for me. Now, the first shape I want to make is one that I actually don't particularly like. A few years ago this shape seemed to be everywhere, and all it is a flat surface in the centre with a vertical rim. They always reminded me a bit of dog food bowls, but let's see, perhaps with a layer of crackle glaze that dulls the corners, softening what would otherwise be a very angular shape, there's a chance it might work. The rim is roughly set, and then I use a straight plastic kidney to compress the bottom, creating a lovely smooth, flat surface. This is also one of the rare instances where I use a kidney in each hand to compress the rim so it's smooth on either side. The lip itself is then chamois smoothed, and I've left it relatively thick, as I think I'm probably going to trim this shape down a bit to be more refined and delicate, maybe even lowering the lip too, as I think part of what makes these look like dog bowls is the height of this outer portion, and I think if it was just a tad lower, it would be better. And with that, the batt can simply be lifted away, and you'll notice that I'm not wiring them off at this stage. Instead, that's something I'm probably going to do the following morning, after the plates have firmed up somewhat. Now, this next side plate is probably going to be the most simple shape you can imagine. In fact, at this stage, all I'm going to throw is a simple flat disc of clay. That's it. But once leather hard, I'm going to trim it to have a much deeper undercut beneath, so the plate looks almost like it's floating. You'll also notice that here, intentionally, I'm beginning with a piece of clay that I haven't patted into a round shape, which should demonstrate how it's slightly more tricky to get it centered initially, as compared to a lump of clay that's been worked into a nice round shape. It's doable, as long as the clay is soft, but if you are working with much harder stuff, it can make the process of centering just so much more difficult. Any irregularities in the clay at this point will be exaggerated as it's pressed into a disc and widened, in the exact same way that they might if you were pulling the walls up thinner and thinner. Therefore, coning the clay up and down a couple of times will help even things out, and the only real difference is that any irregularities are much easier to fix in a plate shaped like this. As there's no height to the vessel, you don't have to worry about the form collapsing. You can simply fix the undulation, or push the lump of clay back into the middle to centre it before squashing it flat, widening it and trying again. The one thing I will do, beyond making this just a flat disc, is throw the top surface so that it's very slightly concave, and this will be something I exaggerate slightly at the leather hard stage too. This way, when the piece is coated thickly in glaze, it'll fill this hollow up to create a flat surface, whereas if I left it just totally flat and then glazed it really thickly, the top surface would almost become slightly convex, which isn't really a quality you want in a plate. As time goes by, to keep the pad of clay sticky, I occasionally sprinkle water on it. It really doesn't need much, and the last thing you really want to do is douse it in water, as otherwise the piece of MDF, or whatever type of batt you're using, will never stick. Now, the next shape is going to be almost exactly the same, although in this case I want to leave the rim much wider and blockier, and with very sharp corners on either side of it, to hopefully, eventually encourage the glaze to break nicely over them. It looks and feels quite heavy at the moment, but after trimming the underside a touch and really sharpening the ledges around the top, I think it will look a bit more defined. The other thing I do when throwing plates, or anything on a batt, is really clean the batt itself. In a way, it's just easier to tidy it up at this stage, as compared to potentially having to wipe them clean in the future. In fact, I don't think I ever really wash these batts. The most I do is scrape the clay off from beneath the pot after it's been wired off, but you don't really want to soak batts in too much water, as doing so is generally what causes them to warp. The difference that adding some water to the middle can make is huge. It needs to be damp and tacky, not soaking with water, as if it's too wet, the lump of clay just won't stick down onto this. If I do over-wet it, I tend to spin the wheel and keep my hand pressing down onto this section until most of the water has been absorbed by the MDF or has come off on my hand, leaving me with a sticky surface that the piece of clay will just weld onto. Obviously, if you have dusty batts that haven't been used in a while, wet clay just won't stick to them quite in the same way, so you do need to think about this when attaching lumps of clay to them. Now this side plate has a bit more of a peculiar shape, thrown with an indentation in the side. It sort of makes it feel like a Diablo, if you know what those are. But otherwise the idea is to try and replicate a shape that you can often find on the tops of some of my bowls. I'm not sure how this one's going to work, or whether I'm going to like it or not, but I'm going to have to see it glazed and fired before I make a final decision. I really enjoy throwing sessions like this, where the aim is to create a batch of pots where no two are alike. In a way, I'm thinking not only about the shape at this stage, but how it's going to look once the glaze has covered it. Here's the same bucket I keep to the left of me, by the way. Now, if I was making normally, without filming, I probably wouldn't need this, but when filming my YouTube videos, the amount of times I have to wash my hands is just absurd. But it's also so useful for scraping the slip off my hands against. Or, if my hands are just getting too covered in clay and I need a reset, the bucket is just there. I don't have to go to the sink and wash the clay off my hands into the clay trap. Instead, this bucket of hot water is sort of like the first line of defence, as a majority of the waste clay comes off in this bucket. In fact, it never really makes it near the sink, which means that in 5 years I've only ever had to empty my clay trap once, and even then it was only about 2/3 full. The bucket I use is on wheels, which makes it easier to move around when it's not in use. But I know this isn't something you can easily do in, say, a community studio or a college, and that's one of the joys of having your own workshop, as you can customise your workspace to match your workflow. For instance, if I didn't produce any sort of content for social media, I think I'd probably have my wheel tucked away in some cosy corner somewhere. But as I do spend so much time filming, I've placed my wheel in such a way that I can get a camera all the way around it, so that I can film what I'm doing from every angle. In a way, it isn't the most practical setup in terms of making pots, but for filming and creating these sorts of videos, it is. Truth be told, I haven't really made that many plates over the past couple of years. They can be somewhat of a pain to fire, as a single plate takes up so much space inside the kiln, meaning they aren't particularly cost effective to make. If you are making them en masse, you need either dozens of kiln shelves or special, smaller plate setters that you can stack. Either way, you end up firing a tremendous amount of kiln furniture, as opposed to actual pots themselves. So in my practice, if I'm firing plates, I tend to dedicate 2 or 3 shelves to them per firing, with the rest being filled up with other pieces, such as mugs and bowls and jars and teapots. I don't actually own enough kiln furniture to do a firing of nothing but plates, but having a kiln packed that densely also affects how the kiln is fired. So in some ways I'm rather happy that I don't make tons of them, but I have been thinking about them rather a lot lately, so hopefully a couple at least make it into my future shop restocks. There is a technique for flattening discs of clay like this when throwing plates, where you use something like a rolling pin or a piece of PVC pipe, which you wet and then press down on the piece of clay, the round length of the tool pressing down over the very centre and across the expanse of clay. It does work, but it isn't a technique I use, as I don't particularly like the loss of sensation that occurs when there's such a big tool between the clay and your hands. I prefer to just use the side of my palm, and if the clay is soft enough, you really shouldn't have much of an issue pressing the clay down, but if you are, there's no harm in trying it. I'm purposefully leaving most of these quite thick, as once they've turned leather hard, I plan on trimming feet on them. I won't leave any of them with a simple flat bottom, as generally speaking when upturning a pot, I like to see that some attention was spent finishing it. For this piece, I'm going to make the rim stepped, mimicking a feature you might have seen on the bottoms of mugs I've made recently, or on a sculptural vessel covered in steps. I'll leave links to both of those videos in the description below. When defining these features at this stage, I don't spend time finishing them so they're perfectly formed. In fact, it's a bit easier to simply roughly shape them at this point, and then, once leather hard, they'll be much easier to crisp up. I even sometimes just run a very dense sponge over the steps to slightly soften the sharper edges and to even them out. think this one's going to look great, although they're all a bit brutalist, aren't they? Save for the totally flat ones. Either way, you may have noticed that I've also placed these on the floor, and it's here where I'll dry them slowly overnight with a canopy of sorts constructed over them so they don't dry out too quickly. When making plates, the last thing you want to do is rush the drying process, and ideally you want to dry them evenly all the way around, as if a draft hits one side of a plate and causes that side to dry out faster, it will shrink more and potentially begin to lift up off the batt if you wire them off. That's also another reason why I don't wire these off until the following day, as at this stage the plates are sort of attached to the MDF batts, so even if they were to dry out unevenly, they can't really move. Now that they've stiffened up, the next step is going to be wiring them off, and thereafter, as I'm going to actively be with these plates throughout the day, I'll be able to manage how they dry far easier, flipping them upside down when need be, rotating them, and making sure that they turn leather hard evenly. Wiring these off can be a bit of a challenge. If there's no groove around the base of the piece, I make a very light one with a scraper like this. I then turn it around and slot this wire into the mark. The batt itself is braced with a knee, and I hold a very fine metal wire taut and drag it underneath the plate. If the plate is firm enough, I can just lift it away, and at this point I want to place it onto a fresh batt, as the dry MDF will absorb moisture from the bottom of the plate, helping to dry it out. If the plates are still quite soft, this is how I transfer them onto another batt. I don't lift them up, as that could bend the object too much. Instead, I just slide it across onto the dry batt. I then scrape off the excess, and this is about as much as I ever clean these batts. Also, when wiring pots off like this, sometimes one side will bend up. In this instance, I simply push them over onto the other batt, and then I spend some time flattening it, carefully pressing it down with my palm so that raised side lowers. If you have a more delicate form, you can also place another batt on top of it, and then lightly press that batt down, sandwiching the plate in between them, and hopefully completely flattening it. If you let the plates dry out too much though and then try wiring them off, it can be a real challenge. So ideally, you want to wire them off when the tops are just sort of approaching leather hard, but the bottoms are still relatively soft. As if the bottom half is too hard, actually dragging the wire through without making a mistake, such as letting the wire bow up slightly, slicing away more clay than you'd like, is rather common. I then take these thin scraps of clay and immediately throw them into my reclaim bucket, whereupon these wafers of stoneware quickly disintegrate. I also use this bit of clay like a magnet to pick up the smaller scraps of clay left on the table. And I'm afraid, due to a busy week, I can't quite fit everything into this single video, so in next week's upload, I'll be trimming all of these and taking you through the process of how I do that, whilst retaining really delicate details on the vessels and working in a way that avoids warping and damage to the plates. Let me know which shape you like the most. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you next week.